Alrighty, so we're going to be looking at The Foreigner by Ratnasingham today, and it's really to tie in with what we've been studying throughout this unit, which is the ways in which the Australian identity is represented in literature, but in particular in poetry, and we have touched on music. So the real core of this unit is that literature and writing, particularly poetry, is a powerful way of exploring and raising different perspectives and understandings of what it means to be Australian. So the poem that we're looking at comes from a migrant perspective, and I think you need to keep in your mind as you read through this some of the things that we looked at earlier in the unit. And one of those was about how prevalent migration is in Australia, and that such a large percentage of Australians have come from migrant backgrounds. So we are very culturally diverse. In fact, over 28% of our population were born overseas. So these are people who have memories and experiences of different cultures and still have ties to them, and they form a part of their own personal identity. So when we have a country and a culture that is defined by people with so many different experiences, it becomes really difficult to articulate and to talk about, well, what does it mean to be Australian? What does that actually mean? And people often turn to the stereotypes or the images or the ideas that were developed during early settlement, when the European British colonists first came to Australia. But the reality is that those images, they don't necessarily correlate with the current Australians' background, their history, and their experience of Australia. In fact, very few Australians live in the bushland. Mostly we are in cities. So it's difficult to talk about. This poem is interesting because it uses a simile of a bird throughout the piece as a motif, and that represents the experiences of migrants. And if you think about the natures of birds, they don't necessarily have a set home. They jump around, they're timid, they're quite fragile, they're easily scared, they move a lot like a migrant. So keep that in mind. Christine Ratnasingham is a Sydney-based writer, but she was born in Sri Lanka and grew up in England and Australia. So she is a migrant herself and has encaptured those experiences of her own migration and that of her family and her friends in this poem. So what we'll do is we'll read through the stanzas of the poem, stop, talk. You'll need to pause and take notes, and I would think that you would be circling and highlighting sections of the text I'm pointing out and adding notes to them on the side, and that's called annotation. You will see some of my annotations on the screen. You're welcome to add them to your poem, but I think this isn't just an exercise of writing down what you see on my screen. You should be listening to some of the ideas that I'm saying and then building on it by adding your own to the poem as well. Like a little bird you've never seen before, who appears to have accidentally flown in through a slightly open window and into an enclosed installation, enlarged with people busily pecking at their own and other people's lives, flocking, talking, necking, laughing. Okay, so you're thinking of this bird as a migrant, and it appears to have accidentally flown in, and that adverb there, accidentally, and an adverb's a word that describes a verb, the verb being flown. This gives a sense that the migrant was kind of unaware. So it connotes or implies that their final destination, and certainly that's true, particularly for refugees or people that are forced to leave their home for due to conflict, that they might not know their final destination. And through a slightly open window, I'm thinking about this word slightly open window. window. If the window that they're coming into is Australia, or any new country for that matter, the idea that it's slightly open gives us this sense that there are limited opportunities, or that migrants aren't welcome, or there is a very few number that are allowed in. So it does make it seem that it's quite a hard to accomplish feat. Into an enclosed installation. So once inside this room, you really get through enclosed a sense of entrapment and claustrophobia. That this is a small little space that's difficult to find any freedom in. Alrighty, so the next little section, enlarged with people busily pecking at their own and other people's lives, flocking, talking, necking, laughing. So you've got this imagery here of the native inhabitants of this space, and these present tense verbs, flocking, talking, necking, laughing. They give us an understanding of comfort, of ease, of camaraderie, or in other words, friendship between them. Oblivious to what has just happened. You've seen it. So this use of second person pronouns here, pronouns, a word that replaces a noun, it's addressing the reader. It's confronting them. It's provoking them to question themselves. But you're paralyzed with hopelessness. It's obviously a metaphor, you're not literally paralyzed, but it is addressing the way in which people respond to migrants when first meeting them. There's a sense of that you can't possibly help them, hopelessness, and then very little action as well. To be paralyzed is to not move. So when seeing new people or uncomfortable people, Ratnasingham's making a suggestion that people aren't as helpful as they could be in that situation. What can you do? She's too fast to catch, filled with moments of panic, then stillness. And this idea of what can you do, often that's something that we say to ourselves, oh, what could I do to help, or who am I to help? And those things that we tell ourselves absolves us of the responsibility. It's a cliche, an overused, tired phrase. Oh, what can you do? Oh, there's nothing I could do. And often in reality, there is something that we could do if we chose to. So she is critiquing that way in which Australian public observe and watch migrants, but do have very little action. And you watch her realizing now that only seconds later, this furiously flapping bird, once frightened, now seems okay, quite happy in fact. So you've got this alliteration of furiously flapping here. And I've called it fricative. Fricative is the sound that it makes, and it's the f sound. It's quite forceful, and it mirrors that panic and stress, and as I've said here, desperation of the newly arrived migrants. They're trying to find an equilibrium, to find a comfort, to find stability, and that's shown in that action of furiously flapping. But you see that they, once frightened, now seems okay, quite happy in fact. Exploring her surroundings, making the most of the situation, nibbling at crumbs, jumping around feet, moving along the crowd, blending in. So these switch in verbs now from flapping to nibbling, jumping, blending in, which is somewhat similar if we go up to flocking, talking, necking. So this idea of no longer moving around, of eating, of trying to fit in with surroundings. And seems that even if you wanted to help her back outside, you may frighten her more, and perhaps even be going against her will. And so all you can do now is simply watch and slightly amuse. Who's to say she doesn't belong here? So in all of this, we've returned back to you. So that second person pronoun. All you can do is watch. And watching, once again, another verb that is quite passive, suggesting this distance between the migrants and the citizens. There's this unwillingness or inability to get involved and to take responsibility. And who's to say she doesn't belong? We all do, don't we? And I really think leaving this rhetorical question at the end is really to critique this perception of Australia being a land of acceptance, of a fair go, where everyone who's willing can thrive. And I think she's really drawing attention to the fact that there are many who don't feel as if they belong in Australian society, and that's because they're not recognised, they're simply watched, and that there is a social and cultural divide between these people. So I think in this final rhetorical question, and I would be writing this if I was you, Ratnasingham is really provoking us, the audience, and you should add this on the end, I'm not going to put it up there, to question those core Australian values of equality and fair go, and to suggest an alternative perspective where migrants don't fit in and aren't acknowledged as members of society. So just to wrap up, if you need to pause and go back and take some notes and add your own notes in, please do. Take the time to really think about this. Think about the perspective that's represented of what it is to be Australian, because this is one alternative to the mainstream. And it looks at the difficulties and the struggles of fitting in with a new culture and that desperate desire to do so. And certainly when you think about that 28% of our Australians were born overseas, this is a huge part of what it means to be Australian for many people, and we really need to integrate that into what we know and think about the Australian identity. All right, thanks.